What's up, YouTube? Welcome to the Counting Wisdom podcast. After I made my podcast on, kind of analyzing the wicked, it sparked a thought in me about, overcoming sin. And, I was making some statements at the end of my last podcast about how, there are some things we don't necessarily understand about evil. And, I think that sometimes we don't recognize the power of sin as far as, sometimes as Christians, we can sort of think of sin in a way of like, oh, those certain things are so dumb, or, hey, why would anyone do that? But yet, when you look at the numbers, even though obviously we can't sort of look at the numbers, but as far as Jesus' statement, as many are going to destruction, clearly there are conscious choices that people are making in regards to sin. And so, I think there are, some things that, we can sort of try to think about in regards to why some people choose sin. There are things that I think obviously even as Christians we are sort of tempted in. I think some things we may not necessarily ever really think about, and then other things are not necessarily tempting, even though we may think about it, but it's not necessarily something that we are sort of interested in doing. And so, at times, it makes sense sometimes to, judge someone in regards to doing what's wrong. But at the same time, as people, there are many things that we do find attractive, but also when you think about it from the standpoint of angels sinning, which are supposed to be, angels are, coming from the presence of God, having at least supposed to be having more knowledge than what we have. When you think about why are people choosing sin in the masses, I don't think it's such an easy topic to explain. Obviously, God has chosen, light from the beginning, or it's not necessarily so much of a choice. Maybe it's a combination of a choice, but it's also who God is outside of the fact of really defining God in the first place. Sometimes we think we understand what God is, and I guess we can kind of explain it as far as, him being like a person in a way, but just much smarter or better. But, we sort of think of God like that, like, oh, he's something like a person, but yet, different attributes. But, God really says in the Bible that he is not a human being. And so, I don't even think we fully know exactly, how to define God, for one. And so, sometimes it kind of makes sense when you think about, maybe someone made that choice, because, they couldn't really help it or something. But when I was sort of talking about this topic of the wicked, when you think about people sinning in mass, as far as, apparently Jesus is saying that more people go to heaven, more people go to hell versus going to heaven. And so, can it be, even when you think about angels, can it be that everyone is sort of dumb in some way, or, foolish? I don't think it may be that easy. And I think some people are at different levels in regards to sin. Obviously, you have to have faith in Jesus Christ in order to go to heaven. But I think people are sometimes not always consciously thinking in certain categories in regards to sin. When you think about maybe someone doing drugs, that a drug addict, is thinking, but he's not necessarily thinking in the same way as, a sober person is thinking. When you think about, someone who is, drunk, they're not really consciously thinking at all, in the same way, at least when we can maybe reflect on times we have drunken alcohol and we know that, hey, our thinking isn't always there. And so, I think there are different levels of how people are sinning, maybe in some ways, definitely different level of intelligence, but also I believe that there is a different level of punishment in regards to sin, even though in general, when it says someone is going to the lake of fire, I don't know if, someone's body can be more acclimated, I guess, to endure some of the agonies of the lake of fire. But, as Christians, at least, most of us do believe that there are different levels of punishment in regards to, the lake of fire, even though most people who say that don't necessarily go into the details about how there is different punishments. But, it could come from the standpoint of, maybe a person's body is sort of acclimated, or, in some spots of the lake of fire, it's not as hot or is not as unpleasant. I don't know. But I think most of us Christians do believe that, it is not necessarily fair for, someone to, who hasn't necessarily murdered, 10 people or something versus someone who, maybe was just, some other type of sinner. It's not necessarily fair for them to have the same judgment. But anyway, I think there are just some people who, have that proclivity of choosing the darkness. And why is it more in masses? I don't know if it's maybe something that is sort of because someone is less intelligent than the other person, or less aware, or I think at some point though, I know when I was a kid and when I was a teenager, I think my thinking was different than when I became an adult, and I think, there's a lot of things that kind of, play into different, factors of how we sin. I think that in some ways you can have more self-control, and other ways you don't have as much self-control. And so when you consider how God is saying that, we are born sinners, on some level you cannot necessarily charge someone for maybe Adam and Eve's sin of, bringing the whole human race into being a sinner. And then it doesn't really make sense to charge maybe a kid who clearly thinks different than a teenager or an adult in regards to sin, even though, kids can sort of do some of the same sins that adults do, but it's definitely not in the same way. Um, you know, you've never heard of maybe a kid, kidnapping another kid or something. And so, but I have heard of kids, maybe accidentally shooting their friend, which, would be sort of murder, but it's not necessarily really the definition of murder. So you have heard of kids sinning, but it's not in the same capacity as an adult. And so it doesn't really make sense for God to sort of send someone to hell for all of eternity for, playing with a gun and, accidentally shooting their friend, or, for someone to go to hell for all of eternity because Adam and Eve, who are someone, completely separate from us in a way, ate from a tree, and, we're all compelled to sin. When the Bible describes sin, as far as what Jesus said, he says whoever sins is a slave of sin. And even though the world may have the mindset of, I'm choosing to do this sin, at some point I believe we enter into some sort of thought about whether we want to get help with this sin or not, or try to stop it or something. And so I believe what God is really judging for us for is something specific in regards to sin. And I think it is, from our perspective, after Adam and Eve have fallen, what I think of it as is someone choosing to remain a slave, to sin. Someone choosing to continue in sin. And obviously, one of those choices would be because they love the sin or love the darkness. But either way, it's more of a choice to continue to do that sin, especially when we are talking about maybe maturing from a kid or a teenager. You hear kids or teenagers, starting to get drunk maybe when they're teenagers, 13 years old, they started smoking cigarettes, or 15 years old they started drinking or sleeping around. And so some sins can start young in a younger age, but I do believe people do reach a certain point in their life, and I think this is sort of where we get some of our laws, where especially maybe in America, we say, a person can't drink until they are 21. Or we usually consider someone an adult when they're 18. And I think we get those laws from, some of the ways that we view how people, grow up, we view that someone is more able to make their own choices when they're 18 and take care of themselves. But you see, a 16-year-old or 15-year-old or a 13-year-old, they are not necessarily thinking, in their mind the same way. And especially when you get into, them being developed, or them, having the mental capacity to understand certain things, like, I have to get a job, or I have to, cook myself dinner, and different things like that. And so obviously those things are a real factor, and I think when talking about, sin, I think some of those things do come into play in regards to God's judgment, and so, yet, maybe we can still ask the question of, why do mass amounts of people seem to choose, unrighteousness, and especially in the way that Jesus put it, of, more people going to hell versus more people going to heaven. And so, you know, I think that, we have to go off of what Scripture really is saying about, people are loving the darkness. And, you know, when you hear about a message of God's goodness, it's not necessarily attractive. When you hear about maybe something like, other than the light, I don't know. The other thing is that people are deceived. And so that's the other part of what's happening here. Even though, God still holds people accountable, regardless of, how, the deceiving part. And so on some level, people are not deceived. At least we can come to that conclusion just because, God still holds people accountable. And so, I just want to kind of point that out, that, the Bible, when it talks about Adam and Eve sinning, it doesn't come from the standpoint of, Adam and Eve were, sinning on their own. They had the snake in the garden that, kind of pointed them into a certain direction, which was into darkness. The story doesn't show, a split between Adam and Eve. Kinda, the story kind of does sort of split when we later on learn that, there were different ways of Adam and Eve, like different mindset or different thinking that Adam and Eve had. Eve was more deceived than Adam, but, they both ate, but I guess maybe their heart was a little bit different. And so, there's that factor too. And so, there's, I think, a few dynamics in regards to sin. And, I think there are some things that, especially in regards to being deceived, there are some things that you can sort of let yourself be deceived in some way. I think we could sort of look at it like that. Like, if we think about how God is still holding people accountable, on some level, maybe something that you should do or shouldn't do, but yet you do it anyway. And then you hear someone else that is kind of saying, hey, you should do this evil thing. When the right way, you're sort of letting yourself be deceived. And so I think that's what's happening too. But then again, I think if people died when they were teenagers or children, I don't know if the judgment would be the same, and I think that, especially, one could argue that, if you reach a certain age and you die, you do automatically go to heaven. But that's just some of our opinions. I don't think the Bible really goes into much detail, except maybe in regards to babies. And, I know when God was considering the children of Israel going into the promised land, he was talking about how, they would go in, but the adults wouldn't. And so there was kind of a division between children and adults. And so I think we have to consider all these things in regards to, why people continue to sin. I think it's more along the line of, why do maybe an fully grown adult choose to continue in sin? Not necessarily, people who are below 18 or, a full grown adult or something, just because, we kind of have a little bit of insight into why people sin regardless is because, we're born sinners. Now, obviously we could go into questioning why did Adam and Eve even choose to eat from that tree? Especially when you think about the whole concept of a tree, you would think like, it would be sort of an easier test, at least, when we think about, more things that are enticing these days, I guess. But yet, the whole story starts with just a tree. And so, some things, I don't think it really makes sense in a way, when you talk about, how Adam and Eve weren't even able to say no to, eating from a tree, and obviously, when you learn a little bit more about the tree, then that changes it. Obviously it wasn't just portrayed as a normal tree. It was a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and I like what other people have said is that, the tree, I think, did have real power to it, but I think it really represents, just someone choosing to do right or to do wrong. It's not necessarily, it could have been anything, God just used the tree, but, when God could have just gone into maybe the 10 Commandments directly, hey, Adam, don't kill Eve, but yet God didn't necessarily start from that level, because there's a lot of direction that, God could have told Adam and Eve, especially when you think about, the wrong things that a person can do. God didn't start off with saying, Adam, don't kill Eve, or Adam, you can't sleep with Eve until, we have a ceremony, or, I don't know. There's a whole bunch of things, laws that we know now, but God didn't start off with that. He started off with, don't eat from the tree. But I think God could have definitely started off with a more specific command in regards to sin. And so, one thing I don't understand is, what Adam and Eve mindset was in regards to, the way that they thought without having a knowledge of good and evil. And then I was reading a children's book the other day, and it went into detail. I mean, it went not into detail, but it told the story of how Solomon asked for wisdom to know the difference between good and evil, which sparked the thought in my mind of, there has to be a certain level of knowledge of good and evil that, we have, because, we already do have a knowledge of good and evil. But, when Solomon prayed the prayer to have the wisdom to know the difference between good and evil, it made me think that, wow, clearly there is something that we don't really understand about good and evil, because why would Solomon even ask that question? And so that makes me think that, even when God said that, we have become like him, knowing good and evil, it seems to still be in a different way in regards to good and evil. I don't know. There has to be something that, is sort of missing, when you look at Solomon's prayer in regards to good and evil. And so, I want to come back to this topic. My work break is ending, but I thought I wanted to just start this one, even though I probably should have waited so I can have more time to talk about this. But, I want to come back to this topic. So thanks so much for checking out this podcast. And I will talk to you on the next one. I will try to, give some more of my thoughts on sin. And I think one thing that this does is sort of gets us thinking. For those that clicked on it, sort of gets us thinking, and you can probably think of, something, more about scripture when you hear someone else's thoughts on it. And so anyway, thanks so much, and I will talk to you on the next one. See ya.